Hi, everyone. This is Scott Young joining you from New York City, which feels a little bit more like Singapore these days with some heat and humidity. But in any case, I'm very happy to be with you and to be part of Habit Day. And I'd like to start off, in fact, by thanking Sam and his team, both for organizing today's event and for inviting me to speak. With that said, I'll jump in. And I'm also very excited to be talking with you about work, because I'm assuming that a lot of what you'll be hearing today is more perhaps about individual decision making. And I thought this might complement that quite well. I'll start with what I think is probably a not too controversial premise, which is that people at work are indeed still people. Again, that may sound quite obvious, but I will tell you, often at my work, I get a lot of questions about, does this work with doctors? Are these behavioral science principles applicable in Germany or Asia? Because these are really rational people and so forth. And of course, the underlying reality is that at work, we're very much subject to the same cognitive limitations and the resulting behavioral heuristics that we are at home. So, another way to think about it is it's not as though we're all, Homer Simpson struggling to do the right thing, to eat well, to exercise, to get things done, etc. And then we go to our work environment and become supermen or superwomen. Certainly, we may be very productive at work and may be very effective at our work, but again, we're still employing a lot of the heuristics or shortcuts that we use to navigate through our daily lives. And in fact, at my work, PRS, I should say BVA Nudge Unit, and indeed, we do some work in the medical and healthcare field with oncologists. And the incoming premise might be that these would be the most rational people in the world. But indeed, they're very, very busy people. And as a result, they fall into some of the very same shortcuts and heuristics that we all use to get our work done and to make quick decisions and to get through our days. Now, what's the difference when we talk about the work environment? Well, I guess I'd say that the main difference is that at work, we're often involved in group decision making. And I picked this image, I think captures some of the joy that we all feel sometimes in group environments and group decision making environments. Although obviously for many of us, and probably most of us, group interaction and group decision making may look a little bit more like this lately. But in any case, I do think, when we talk about group decision making and we look at it through a behavioral science lens, I think another important premise to think about and start with is the reality that group decision making can be far more effective than individual decision making, but it can also be a lot weaker. So the assumption that we're always better when we're doing it with others simply is not true. And again, that's because sometimes individual biases or heuristics can be compounded if we're not careful about the way we work together. So today I'll talk a little bit about some of those heuristics, many of which I think will be familiar to you, and more importantly, start to turn the corner and think about, what are some of the more fundamental things we can do about this. Now, in terms of the heuristics, I think I promised you 5, so I went there, but I should mention that there's certainly more than 5 to choose from. And you'll notice that many of these are certainly heuristics that come into play with us as individuals. But again, they can also come into play collectively as a group. And I'll talk about them briefly in the context of decision-making and group decision-making. First and foremost, I thought I'd start with the confirmation bias, my personal favorite, one that I feel as though we see minute to minute, day to day, political, certainly in the political realm these days. The essential idea that people see what they want to see, take in the facts that they choose to take in, and essentially ignore the rest. But I think it's important to keep in mind that this also comes into play when we're weighing facts or perhaps ignoring facts and information in terms of decision making, big decisions at work for our companies, our organizations, and so forth. A second heuristic, which often comes into play, again, when we talk about more complex decisions, is the anchoring effect. Fundamentally, the idea that the first piece of information that comes into play or that comes to us can serve as an anchor, and then all other information is viewed through that lens and relative to that, which can be a problem and can mislead us. The third one that I wanted to mention, because I think it's important to keep in mind, is the endowment effect. Now, this illustration comes from a very famous study that you may be familiar with, essentially showing that people value things that are their own at a higher rate than things that are not their own. However, I think it's important to keep in mind that this can very much come into effect as well when we think about our ideas and our opinions. Essentially, we value our own opinions, tend to value our own opinions and our own ideas more than that of others, even if our ideas are perhaps not more informed than that of other people. Fourth, we have the status quo bias, essentially the idea that as humans, we tend to drift back to and prefer its current state of affairs, which means that we can view risk very differently. The risk of changing is always quite apparent to us, the potential downside, but the risk of not changing, the risk of staying the same, which is a very real one in the business world, of course, is one that we tend to underestimate or undervalue. So again, probably familiar heuristics to many of you, but ones that have direct implication when we think about decision making. And finally, perhaps the one that may have already been on your mind, the idea of groupthink. And as I show this, I think one important point to make out is that this visual suggests a situation where people are agreeing to get along, essentially, but they don't really agree. They're suppressing their real beliefs. What I wanted to emphasize is that this isn't always the case. Groupthink can very much happen where people all do agree, and they really honestly agree. The problem, again, is that they're all falling into the same traps, so to speak, or the same quick decisions that may or may not be wrong. Kind of all heading off the cliff, so to speak, together, but actively doing so and wanting to do so and believing in the decision that they're making. Now, why does groupthink happen? Well, I kind of think of it perhaps as the darker side to social norms. Often in behavioral science, we talk about potential positives of social norms, using what other people are doing as a way to navigate through, perhaps as a way to incent or encourage positive behaviors. But social norms and the larger idea that we are fundamentally social creatures and so much of our identity is tied to being in the group can also certainly lead us in poor directions. It can lead us to, again, not just say yes when we don't mean it, but to really believe yes and not really take a look at the information and make the right decisions. Perhaps the more important piece of the equation is what can we do about it? And I think perhaps the most important thing is this idea of beginning with doubt. And actually, I take that term a little bit from Warren Buffett, who speaks and writes a lot about this idea of approaching his own investment and perhaps managerial decisions from a position of doubt. I think when the more you learn about behavioral science and the more you think about some of the heuristics I mentioned, the only logical response, I think, is to not be overconfident in our decisions and to encourage ourselves to think twice, particularly when we come quickly to a decision or have an entire group express no back and forth and come to a decision. So again, this idea of beginning with doubt, questioning ourselves, questioning our decisions, and as you'll see in a moment, going through some processes to help make a difference. But at the same time that we begin with doubt, I think it's incredibly important to remind ourselves that just awareness and intent are certainly not enough to make a difference. Again, if behavioral science teaches us anything, it's that being aware and having positive intent does not necessarily lead to action. And I always like to cite New Year's resolutions as our annual reminder that we don't always follow through on things, even if we know what we would indeed like to do. So again, knowing these heuristics, having them in our heads is not really enough to consistently make a difference unless we start to take some fundamental actions around it. And what are those fundamental actions? Well, I think to me, the key word is processes. when we're speaking individually, we often think perhaps about interventions, about nudges and so forth. And I do think they have a role, but when we speak about teams and groups and organizations, I think we have to think about processes that multiple people follow together, whether it's in meetings or whether it's in decision-making processes in this case. And before I share some more thoughts, I really did want to take a half step back and just make the point that there are so many people who have done some terrific research and writing on this topic, and I'm really borrowing from them and hopefully building a little bit on that. For one, my colleague Eric Singler at BVA Nudge Unit, who's done some great work on in his book Nudge Management, Cass Sunstein and others. Piers Cass has written books on absolutely everything. And one article that I feel does just a terrific job of really quickly summarizing, it's a Harvard Business Review, HBR article that you see referenced here about group decision making. And really that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's many resources out there that I could potentially point you to if you want to dive deeper on the topic. But collectively, what do these folks have to say? Well, if I'm going to boil it down to 3 or 4 points, they'd probably be this. First, when we talk about group or team decision making, perhaps obviously the nature of the group is incredibly important. And one of the clearest and easiest things to think about is that if that group becomes bigger than perhaps 6 or 7 people making a decision, you really should think twice. Because in fact, a lot of the heuristics that I mentioned tend to get even stronger or have a bigger effect when you get larger groups. So again, optimal decision-making in groups, perhaps closer to 3, 4, 5 people rather than 8, 9, or 10. And heterogeneous is kind of an interesting term. I mean, I think a lot of us, when we see that, perhaps we jump right to things of diversity tied to race, ethnicity, etc. And certainly that can be very important, but I'd also think about heterogeneity in the context of people's experience, roles, responsibilities, and perspective in coming to a decision. So multidisciplinary teams, for example. But having the right team is not nearly enough as well. We all know we can get the right people in the room and have a very a conversation that's not as productive as we'd like. So one important process step is the idea of collecting opinions independently, and perhaps anonymously in some cases as well. Again, having people do some research up front, gather the information, and share it. And that can happen in many forms, but again, before they have the opportunity to get together in person or perhaps online, and where some of these heuristics may have a stronger impact. And an interesting point that maybe might not be quite as self-evident is defining the role of expertise. And as this picture illustrates, yes, of course we want to bring in expertise, whether that's the expertise of individual team members or outside expertise. But an important point, and a trap that sometimes we fall into, is not tightly defining the role of these experts and essentially defaulting to perhaps giving them more emphasis than they should have. So again, if you're calling on someone for their expertise, we should be very clear about how it is just an input to a larger decision and exactly what that expertise is, because otherwise it can be misattributed, so to speak, or again, overweighted. And finally, I think one of the absolute most important points around process, and one of the easiest ones to do, is this idea of a devil's advocate. Fundamentally pointing out one or perhaps more than one individual in a group whose express role, and this role can rotate perhaps, whose express role is to question the group consensus, is to poke holes, is to force some things, and essentially help mitigate or counter some of the groupthink heuristics that naturally indeed happen. And I make this reference to psychological safety, which is a term that some of you may know from the work of Amy Edmondson and others. And I think that's maybe a more macro level, essentially creating an environment that allows this person to speak and to do his or her job effectively. Because we can appoint a devil's advocate, but if that person is not in a safe environment where those inputs are going to be viewed favorably and as a positive part of the process, of course, they're not going to contribute the way they could. So I assume we're running pretty short on time here, and I did want to just wrap up by essentially circling back to the three main points that I hope you'll take away. First and foremost, again, perhaps an obvious one, but these heuristics are absolutely relevant at work, and they're relevant really in all work because all work is being done by human beings. Certainly they'll take on different forms because context varies, but these same fundamental heuristics certainly influence our decision-making at work, whether it's individual or collective. Secondly, let's not default to the idea that group decisions are inherently better just because we're getting 5 people or more in a room together speaking about an issue. They can be much better if we have the right processes to help foster the right discussion and the right inputs. But they can be just as bad, if not worse, and lead us right to some negative outcomes if we don't have those processes in place. And indeed, the word processes is the one that I would have you take away, including some of those very simple things that I mentioned, about gathering input independently and perhaps anonymously in advance, about establishing or designating someone as a devil's advocate. And certainly there are others that I didn't have time to speak about today, but building those things consistently into our decision-making can indeed make a fundamental difference. And I'll also leave you with just one quick resource, which I hope you'll take advantage of. It's just a new book that I and my colleague Eric Singler just put together. We think of it kind of as a BeSci 202 resource in the sense that it's not about fundamental heuristics and behavior, but it's really focused very much on application, the challenges of application, and the opportunities of application in organizations. So again, you see it's available for free download, and love it if you take advantage of that and certainly come back to me with questions, comments, and so forth. You can also find information of this nature at our website, bvanudgeunit.com. And also encourage you to check out the Be Good podcast, where we speak with many of the leaders in the industry, including Amy Edmondson, who I mentioned earlier. And just really listen to them and hear about their work, their passions, what brought them to behavioral science, and so forth. And finally, last but not least, I really welcome the conversation. So I know we don't have time to go back and forth today, but I'd certainly love to hear your questions, your comments, perhaps your criticisms, and to continue the conversation. And I'm very happy to try to point you towards other resources if you'd like to dive deeper, or perhaps look at a sub-issue tied to some of what I talked about today. So thanks a lot, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got a little something out of it, and I wish you the very best for the rest of today. Thanks again. Take care.